The locomotive registry for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, submitted to the Interstate Commerce Commission on March 14, 1889, listed 47 engines in active service. The ink was standard bureaucratic black, the columns aligned with institutional precision. Engine numbers ran sequentially from 101 through 147, each accompanied by manufacturing date, boiler certification, and assigned route. The document bore 3 authorized signatures and the railway's impressed seal. On May 2, 1889, the same railway submitted its quarterly operations report. This ledger, prepared by different clerks in a different department, documented fuel consumption, maintenance schedules, and mileage totals. It recorded operational data for 48 engines. The discrepancy appeared in column 7, page 12. Engine 133 consumed coal, required bearing replacements, and accumulated 1,847 miles between January and March. According to maintenance logs, it departed the roundhouse on 17 separate occasions. According to the master registry submitted 6 weeks earlier, Engine 133 had never been built. Both documents existed in sealed institutional filing systems. Both carried official validation. The railway's chief operations officer, whose signature appeared on both submissions, died of heart failure on June 8, 1889, 3 weeks after the quarterly report reached federal hands. No inquiry was opened. The files remained in separate drawers, uncorrelated, for 36 years. In 1925, during a routine archive consolidation, a junior clerk noticed the numerical impossibility. His notation, penciled in margins grown brittle with age, asked one question: which document contains the error? The question presumed accident. The evidence would not permit that comfort. Federal railway regulation in 1889 required absolute concordance between 3 institutional records: the Master Locomotive Registry, filed annually with the Interstate Commerce Commission; the Operational Ledger, submitted quarterly to federal and state authorities; and the Daily Dispatch Log, maintained by individual stations along every route. This triangulation existed to prevent exactly what it appeared to document: phantom equipment, fraudulent capacity claims, or systematic accounting manipulation. When a locomotive entered service, the process followed rigid sequence. Manufacturers submitted certification to the purchasing railway. The railway's engineering department conducted acceptance inspection, generating a 12-page technical report. Only after chief engineer approval could the engine receive its permanent number and enter the master registry. From that moment forward, every coal shovelful, every scheduled departure, every repair required documentation that flowed upward through administrative channels toward federal oversight. The system assumed institutional honesty, but verified through redundancy. A locomotive could not vanish from one ledger while persisting in another. The paper trails intersected at too many junctions, passed through too many hands, faced too many audits. Engine 133's fuel consumption appeared in Chicago accounting. Its maintenance costs appeared in the Northwestern's financial reports submitted to shareholders. Its assigned crew, engineer, fireman, brakeman, received wages documented in payroll records that survived in the railway's pension archive. These men worked. They were paid. They operated something. But the Interstate Commerce Commission, in its annual review of railway capacity across 14 states, never recorded Engine 133's existence. The procedure had been designed to make this impossible. The evidence suggested the impossible had been carefully arranged. The Interstate Commerce Commission received 127 submissions from the Chicago and Northwestern Railway during 1889. Routine correspondence followed established patterns: requests for route expansion, notices of track maintenance, reports of minor accidents that required federal notation. The language remained consistently formal, the tone cooperative, the bureaucratic rhythm unbroken. No letter questioned the registry discrepancy. No amended locomotive roster arrived with explanatory cover sheet. The railway, which filed protests over delayed freight regulations and submitted detailed appeals regarding timber transport quotas, maintained complete silence on the numerical impossibility embedded in its own documentation. Federal inspectors visited the Chicago and Northwestern yards on 4 occasions during 1889. Their reports, filed in buff-colored folders that smelled of machine oil and pressed paper, cataloged boiler pressures, track conditions, worker safety compliance. They photographed switching equipment, measured coal pile volumes, interviewed station masters. None mentioned Engine 133. The inspection protocol required physical verification of all equipment listed in operational ledgers. Inspectors carried clipboards and moved through roundhouses with methodical attention, matching brass plates to registry numbers. The system worked through physical presence. What existed must be seen, what was recorded must be confirmed. 4 inspections, 4 opportunities for correction, 4 reports filed without annotation. In October 1889, a regional supervisor submitted a commendation praising the Chicago and Northwestern for exemplary cooperation with federal oversight. The letter, signed by 3 commissioners, noted the railway's transparent operational practices and recommended it as a model for other carriers. The commendation sat in archives beside documents that, if cross-referenced, would have revealed systematic institutional impossibility. No one performed that cross-reference. Not in 1889. Not for 36 years. The Chicago and Northwestern maintained dispatch logs at 14 stations along its primary routes. These logs, bound in black leather with brass corner guards, recorded every train movement, departure times, arrival times, cargo manifests, crew assignments. Station masters completed entries in real time, each line witnessed by telegraph operators whose initials confirmed simultaneous documentation. The logs existed as legal instruments, admissible in litigation, protected from alteration by their sequential integrity. On the night of February 23, 1889, the Elgin Station log recorded standard traffic. The 6:15 freight departed toward Rockford. The 8:40 passenger service arrived from Chicago, 12 minutes delayed by frozen switches. The 10:05 mail run passed through without stopping, its whistle noted by the night clerk. At 11:47 p.m., the log recorded, unscheduled southbound, engine unclear, no stop, through traffic. The notation violated procedure in 3 specific ways. Company regulations required engine numbers for all moving equipment. Federal law mandated advance notice for any train operating outside published schedules. Station protocol prohibited describing locomotives as unclear when brass identification plates were mounted on every engine's side, visible by lantern light at any distance under 100 yards. The night clerk who wrote the entry was Howard Breslin, a station master with 14 years of service and a personnel record that contained 0 disciplinary actions. His handwriting elsewhere in the log remained consistent, controlled, legible, professionally neutral. Only that one line contained uncertainty. Only that one train moved through darkness without identity. The telegraph log for February 23, which should have contained advance notification of any unscheduled movement, recorded nothing between 10:05 p.m. and 6 a.m. Something passed through. The railway's most experienced station master could not or would not record what he had seen. By this point, 2 facts were no longer in dispute. First, operational records prove that Engine 133 existed in material reality during the first quarter of 1889. It consumed measurable coal, transported documented cargo, required physical repairs performed by named mechanics whose work orders survived in maintenance files. The engine was not clerical fiction. Metal moved, labor was performed, wages were paid for work done upon something real. Second, the institutional system designed specifically to track such equipment contained no evidence of Engine 133's creation, purchase, or authorization for service. The master registry, which captured every locomotive the Chicago and Northwestern owned or operated, recorded a gap where 133 should have appeared. The absence was not damage or filing error. Surrounding numbers remained intact, their entries complete and unaltered. These facts could not coexist under normal conditions. The railway's administrative structure prohibited such divergence. Yet the divergence existed in permanent ink, across multiple departments, in documents that passed through independent verification. The initial finding established one certainty. Engine 133 represented not a mistake, but a carefully maintained impossibility. Someone had operated a locomotive while simultaneously ensuring its official non-existence. The fuel purchases were real. The crew wages were real. The metal that moved through winter darkness was real. But according to every document that should have proven its legitimacy, Engine 133 had never been authorized to exist. The question narrowed from which record contains the error to something more dangerous. Who benefited from operating a train that federal oversight could never inspect? Station dispatch logs from 7 locations along the Northwestern's primary routes contain similar entries between January and April of 1889. The language varied by location but maintained consistent imprecision. At Rockford, late night through traffic, no scheduled stop. At Geneva, southbound passage, uncertain designation. At Crystal Lake, unscheduled equipment, observe only. Each notation appeared between 11:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. Each described movement outside published timetables. Each avoided recording the engine number that regulations required. The pattern emerged across 94 days, across stations separated by significant distances, in logs maintained by different personnel who followed identical federal protocols. Station masters did not simultaneously forget their training. Telegraph operators did not collectively abandon procedure. The coordinated vagueness suggested instruction, not incompetence. Passenger timetables for the Chicago and Northwestern, published in quarterly editions and distributed to ticket offices throughout Illinois and Wisconsin, listed no service between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. The railway advertised itself as operating exclusively during daylight and evening hours, a selling point for families and commercial travelers who valued safety over speed. The company's marketing materials, preserved in Wisconsin Historical Society archives, explicitly promised no midnight departures, no dangerous late-night operations. Yet dispatch logs proved that trains moved through darkness with sufficient regularity, that 7 separate stations developed informal protocols for recording their passage without actually recording anything useful. The escalating question was no longer about one phantom engine. It was about systematic operation of night service that the railway publicly claimed did not exist, documented by employees who had been trained or warned never to document it properly. What moved at midnight that required coordinated institutional blindness? The Chicago and Northwestern was not unique in its administrative complexity. The 1889 railway industry generated documentation at industrial scale. Every company maintaining parallel systems of registries, ledgers, inspection reports, and correspondence that federal regulation demanded. These records, archived in separate institutional repositories, rarely underwent comparative analysis. The assumption held that internal accounting would catch errors before external audit became necessary. In 1925, the archive consolidation that revealed Engine 133 also pulled together comparable records from 5 other Midwestern railways: the Illinois Central, the Milwaukee Road, the Burlington, the Rock Island Line, and the Wisconsin Central. The junior clerk, whose initial notation had questioned which document contained error, expanded his inquiry. He was not investigating misconduct. He was attempting to understand if the Chicago and Northwestern's registry confusion represented common administrative sloppiness. What he found was pattern. The Milwaukee Road's 1889 master registry listed 62 locomotives. Its operational ledger documented fuel consumption for 64 engines. The Illinois Central showed similar divergence: 71 engines registered, 73 in active operation. The Wisconsin Central's quarterly reports reflected maintenance costs for equipment that its federal filings insisted did not exist. Each railway showed the same structural impossibility. Each involved equipment operating during late-night hours. Each involved dispatch logs that used identical evasive language: unscheduled, uncertain designation, observe only. The clerk's notation, dated April 1925, underlined 3 words: industry-wide system. What had appeared to be one railway's accounting dysfunction was actually coordinated operational practice across the entire regional network. The evidence suggested not isolated corruption, but institutional agreement. Railways collectively operating equipment they collectively refused to acknowledge. The implications multiplied. Whatever moved at midnight was not one railway's secret. It was infrastructure. Correspondence between railways in 1889 typically addressed practical coordination: track usage rights, cargo transfer protocols, shared equipment maintenance. The language remained transactional, focused on operational efficiency. Letters were brief, specific, clerical. Federal law required railways to maintain copies of all intercompany communication, a regulation designed to prevent collusion on pricing or anti-competitive behavior. In the Chicago and Northwestern's 1889 correspondence archive, 17 letters used the phrase special accommodation traffic. The term appeared in communications with the Milwaukee Road, the Illinois Central, and the Rock Island Line. Context suggested the phrase referred to cargo or passenger service that existed outside normal schedules, but the letters never specified what the accommodation entailed or who required it. A letter dated March 8, 1889, from Northwestern Superintendent Marcus Thornwell to his Milwaukee Road counterpart used the phrase twice. Your inquiry regarding special accommodation traffic is noted. Our mutual arrangement continues to function as established. No disruption to standard operations has occurred. The letter's passivity was precise. It confirmed something without describing it. It referenced an arrangement without defining terms. It assured continuity without admitting what continued. Similar phrasing appeared in the Illinois Central's archived correspondence. A letter from their Chicago operations director to the Rock Island Line mentioned ongoing special accommodation scheduling and praised discretionary handling by station personnel. Another, dated January 1889, noted that participants understand the necessity of operational flexibility. The language functioned as institutional code, words that meant something specific to their intended readers, while remaining meaningless to anyone outside the system. No letter explained what special accommodation entailed. None identified the traffic's origin, destination, or nature. But 17 letters confirmed it existed, and all participants understood the requirement for silence. Howard Breslin, the Elgin station master who recorded the February 23 unscheduled southbound, lived in company housing adjacent to the station. A two-room structure with a coal stove and a view of the tracks. Railway records showed he earned $42 per month, never missed a shift during his 14-year tenure, and received a commendation in 1887 for preventing a derailment by spotting a fractured rail during a routine inspection walk. Personnel files, preserved because the railway maintained them for pension calculations, contained one unusual notation. In May 1889, 3 months after his ambiguous dispatch log entry, Breslin requested transfer to a daytime-only position at a smaller station in DeKalb. The request cited family health concerns. It was approved within a week, unusual speed for bureaucratic processing that typically required months. Breslin's salary at the DeKalb station dropped to $38 per month. The transfer represented a voluntary pay reduction and a significant decrease in professional status. Station masters did not typically abandon premium positions at major junction points for quiet rural postings. His wife was 28 years old and in documented good health. They had no children. No medical records existed in county archives suggesting illness that would justify relocation. The transfer request, handwritten on company stationery, contained one sentence beyond the standard bureaucratic justification. I have completed my obligations to the current posting and request release from night duties. Federal regulations did not require station masters to work nights. Company policy assigned night shifts on rotating schedules. Breslin's request suggested that his obligations were not standard employment duties, but something separate, something completed, something he no longer wished to perform. He died in 1903. His obituary mentioned railway service but described him as a man who valued quiet routine and the measured pace of small-town life. It did not mention what he had seen at 11:47 p.m. on February 23, 1889. Telegraph logs were maintained by separate personnel from dispatch logs, operated under different supervisory chains and stored in different physical locations within each station. The separation existed as institutional safeguard, independent documentation systems that would reveal tampering if either were altered. Telegraph operators recorded every message transmitted across company lines, including internal operational notifications, with timestamps accurate to the minute. During the first quarter of 1889, telegraph traffic from Elgin Station followed predictable patterns. Between midnight and 5 a.m., operators transmitted an average of 2.3 messages per night, mostly weather reports, occasional maintenance alerts, rare emergency notifications. The volume remained consistent through January and most of February. Beginning February 24th, the day after Breslin's ambiguous dispatch entry, late-night telegraph traffic from Elgin ceased entirely. For 47 consecutive days, between midnight and 5 a.m., the telegraph log recorded 0 transmissions. The silence was not equipment failure. Daytime traffic continued normally. Operators remained on duty, their presence confirmed by shift logs and wage records. The telegraph functioned. The operators were present. But for nearly 7 weeks, nothing moved across the wires during the hours when unscheduled trains moved through darkness. Other stations showed identical patterns. After the first dispatch log notation referring to special accommodation traffic, late-night telegraph activity ceased. The change was not gradual adaptation, but immediate behavioral shift, as though a switch had been thrown. In April, late-night telegraph traffic resumed, but at volumes reduced by 60% compared to January baselines. What had been routine operational communication, weather updates, cargo notifications, maintenance coordination, diminished to near silence. Something had changed. The operators, like the station masters, had learned what required silence and what could be safely recorded. Federal inspection protocol for railways in 1889 included unannounced nighttime visits, designed to verify that equipment maintenance and safety procedures were followed when supervisory personnel were absent. These inspections were rare, perhaps 3 or 4 times per year across the entire regional network. But their unpredictability was the mechanism of enforcement. On March 16, 1889, at 1:20 a.m., Federal Inspector Raymond Kellerman arrived unannounced at the Chicago and Northwestern's Wheaton yards. His report, filed 3 days later, followed standard format. Boiler pressures checked, coal storage conditions observed, watchman alertness verified. Everything noted in precise bureaucratic language, everything found in compliance. The report's equipment inventory section listed 7 locomotives present in the roundhouse. Engine numbers were recorded: 109, 114, 121, 127, 131, 138, 142. Each entry included boiler temperature readings taken from gauge faces, demonstrating that Kellerman had physically approached each machine and recorded specific data. The Wheaton yards could accommodate 9 locomotives. 2 bays stood empty during Kellerman's inspection. Maintenance logs for March 16th showed that 8 engines had been serviced at Wheaton during the previous 24 hours. The discrepancy was minor. 1 engine had presumably departed before Kellerman's arrival, but the maintenance log identified that 8th engine as number 133. According to documented service records, Engine 133 received bearing lubrication and boiler inspection at Wheaton between 6 p.m. on March 15th and 2 a.m. on March 16th. 2 mechanics signed work orders confirming the repairs. The engine was physically present during the exact window when federal inspection occurred. Kellerman's report made no mention of it. He had walked through the roundhouse, recording every engine present. He had moved past the bay where maintenance records proved Engine 133 stood. He had inventoried 7 locomotives where 8 existed. He had been trained to see everything. He had chosen to see selectively. The 1925 archive consolidation eventually examined 207 federal inspection reports filed for Midwestern Railways during 1889. The junior clerk, whose investigation had expanded from simple error checking to systematic analysis, created a comparison matrix. Inspection reports cross-referenced against maintenance logs, station dispatch records, and operational ledgers. 43 inspections showed the identical structural absence, equipment documented in maintenance logs as physically present during inspection windows, but not recorded in federal reports. The pattern crossed 5 railways, involved 17 different inspectors, and occurred at stations separated by hundreds of miles. The absent equipment consistently bore numbers that appeared in operational ledgers but not in master registries. The inspections consistently occurred during late-night hours. The inspector reports consistently demonstrated thoroughness in every other aspect: detailed boiler readings, precise coal measurements, comprehensive safety audits. Only specific locomotives vanished from otherwise meticulous documentation. The omissions were too consistent to represent oversight, too widespread to represent individual inspector corruption, too precisely targeted to represent random error. 43 inspections. 43 identical absences. 17 inspectors who followed identical, unwritten protocols. Federal inspectors in 1889 operated under threat of immediate termination for filing inaccurate reports. Their professional survival depended on aggressive thoroughness. They were not careless men. They were men who had learned what to ignore. The clerk's final notation, dated May 1925, underlined one conclusion. Institutional knowledge, not individual choice, system operated through shared understanding. Whatever moved at midnight had achieved something remarkable. It had trained an entire regulatory apparatus to selectively lose its vision. Railway traffic in 1889 Illinois divided into documented categories, each governed by specific regulations and rate structures. Freight traffic moved agricultural products, manufactured goods, raw materials, all requiring detailed cargo manifests for insurance and taxation. Passenger traffic required published schedules, ticket sales records, and liability coverage that companies purchased through regulated markets. Mail service operated under federal contract with specified delivery windows and penalty clauses for delays. Each category generated documentation that flowed through administrative channels toward government oversight. The system existed not merely for safety, but for taxation, tariff collection, and economic regulation that funded state and federal operations. Special accommodation traffic, which appeared in 17 letters but never in official rate schedules or published timetables, fit none of these categories. It generated no cargo manifests, required no published schedules, appeared in no federal contracts. Yet it consumed coal, required crew wages, caused track wear, and occupied the same physical infrastructure that legitimate traffic used. The operational costs for running Engine 133 between January and April 1889, fuel, maintenance, labor, totaled approximately $3,800, calculated from surviving financial records. This expense appeared in the railway's internal accounting but never in reports submitted to shareholders or regulatory authorities. The money existed. The expense was real, but it was not attributed to any revenue-generating service. Either the railway absorbed significant costs to operate a train that earned nothing, or the revenue from special accommodation traffic moved through accounting channels that left no documentary trace. The first possibility suggested incomprehensible waste. The second possibility suggested systematic fraud on a scale that would require coordination not just within one railway but across the entire regional network. Accounting practices designed to hide income that regulations forbid. The implications no longer involved just phantom equipment. They involved phantom revenue. Money moving through industrial infrastructure while remaining invisible to the systems designed to tax and regulate it. In June 1889, the Chicago and Northwestern Railway submitted its annual report to shareholders. The document, printed on heavy stock with embossed company insignia, presented financial performance in the formal language of corporate transparency. Operating revenue, $4.2 million. Operating expenses, $3.1 million. Net income, $1.1 million. Return on investment, 7.3%, slightly above industry average. The report devoted 3 pages to equipment acquisition and maintenance. It listed locomotive purchases for the year. 2 new engines, manufactured by Baldwin Locomotive Works, both delivered in April and designated as replacements for aging equipment retired from service. The accounting showed depreciation schedules, maintenance cost reductions from newer boiler designs, and projected efficiency gains. Everything appeared coherent. The numbers aligned. The explanatory text matched financial reality that auditors would verify. The report made no mention of 48 locomotives in operational service when only 47 existed in master registries. It did not address Engine 133's fuel consumption or maintenance costs. It described a railway operating exactly as many locomotives as federal documentation claimed it owned. Shareholders received dividends calculated from the reported net income. State regulators reviewed the filing and found compliance with disclosure requirements. Federal commissioners noted the railway's financial stability as evidence that Midwestern transportation infrastructure remained healthy. The official narrative was complete, consistent, and carefully constructed. It described a company operating within regulations, generating predictable profits, maintaining equipment properly. It was the story the railway told itself, told its investors, told the government. And for anyone who read only the annual report, who did not compare it against operational ledgers, dispatch logs, or maintenance records held in separate archives, the official narrative was perfectly believable. It would take 36 years before someone thought to check if the story matched the evidence. Personnel records for the Chicago and Northwestern's engineering department showed standard employment patterns. Chief Engineer Marcus Thornwell earned $2,400 annually and supervised a department of 43 mechanics, boiler inspectors, and equipment specialists. The department's 1889 operational budget of $187,000 covered wages, materials, and facility maintenance, expenses that auditors verified against receipts, work orders, and inventory ledgers. The accounting was transparent. Every dollar spent on locomotive maintenance appeared in financial reports with supporting documentation. The system worked as designed. Expenditures justified by completed work verified by signed orders matched to specific equipment requiring specific repairs. Engine 133's maintenance costs appeared in these records. Bearing replacements in January, $47. Boiler inspection in February, $23. Wheel truing in March, $31. Each expense supported by mechanic signatures, each signature belonging to an employee whose wages were documented, whose existence was verified by payroll records that survived in pension archives. The maintenance occurred. The money was spent. The work was real. But when the engineering department submitted its quarterly equipment status report to federal regulators, a document that listed every locomotive's operational condition and recent repairs, Engine 133 did not appear. The report documented maintenance performed on 47 locomotives. It accounted for every dollar spent. It listed every mechanic's work. It simply attributed the maintenance of one engine to other engines' repair budgets, distributing the costs across equipment that officially existed. The accounting remained accurate in total. The individual attributions were carefully false. The system permitted truth in aggregate while concealing truth in detail. Someone had designed this. Someone had trained accountants to distribute costs in ways that preserved financial accuracy while obscuring operational reality. The official narrative held because the supporting evidence was real. The fraud was not in the numbers, but in what the numbers were said to describe. Station master employment contracts, standardized across the Chicago and Northwestern system, specified duties that included maintaining accurate dispatch logs, reporting all train movements to company supervisors, and cooperating fully with federal inspections. The contracts contained termination clauses that permitted immediate dismissal for filing false reports or concealing operational information. Every station master signed these contracts. The documents were witnessed by company attorneys and filed with state labor authorities. Howard Breslin signed his contract in 1875 when he began employment at Elgin. The contract's language was explicit. The employee agrees to record all train movements through the assigned station with complete accuracy, including engine numbers, crew assignments, and cargo manifests. Failure to maintain complete records constitutes breach of employment terms. The February 23 dispatch log entry, unscheduled southbound, engine unclear, no stop, violated the contract Breslin had signed 14 years earlier. It was not incomplete through negligence. It was deliberately evasive in ways that protected Breslin from charges of filing false reports while simultaneously ensuring no useful information was recorded. But Breslin was not terminated. He was not disciplined. 3 months after writing an entry that should have ended his employment, he requested transfer and was approved with unusual speed. The company had contract language that required accurate reporting. The company had enforcement mechanisms that punished violations. Yet the company tolerated systematic evasion by multiple employees across multiple stations. The contradiction was not accidental. The contracts existed to satisfy regulatory requirements and legal liability standards. The enforcement patterns existed to maintain operational secrecy. The company needed both. Legal documentation proving they demanded accuracy and practical tolerance that permitted coordinated silence. The official standards and the actual practice diverge completely. The divergence was maintained intentionally, year after year, by systems that claimed transparency while rewarding concealment. By spring 1889, two complete operational systems existed within the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. The first system appeared in federal filings, shareholder reports, published timetables, and public-facing documentation. It described a company operating 47 locomotives on scheduled routes during daytime and evening hours, generating revenue through regulated freight and passenger service, maintaining equipment according to published standards. The second system appeared in maintenance logs, dispatch entries, telegraph silence, and inter-railway correspondence. It described the same company operating additional equipment outside published schedules during late-night hours, generating undocumented revenue through special accommodation traffic, maintaining phantom locomotives whose repairs were attributed to other engines. Both systems were real. Both generated authentic documentation. Both employed actual personnel who received documented wages for documented work. The company functioned as two simultaneous organizations occupying the same physical infrastructure. During daylight, it was the railway that federal regulators inspected and shareholders invested in. During darkness, it was something else, a parallel operation that moved through the same stations, used the same tracks, employed the same workers, but existed in administrative blind spots, carefully constructed through coordinated institutional practice. Station masters worked both systems. They recorded official traffic in proper format and recorded unofficial traffic in deliberately vague language. Mechanics repaired both registered and unregistered locomotives, signing work orders that distributed phantom maintenance costs across legitimate equipment. Telegraph operators maintained silence during hours when unofficial trains moved, resuming normal communication when only official traffic operated. The personnel were not deceived. They understood exactly what they participated in. The dual reality was not confusion, but careful operational design. Two businesses operating as one, divided not by physical separation, but by administrative visibility. Federal regulators saw one reality. The railway operated both. From this stage onward, three certainties were established in the institutional record. First, the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, along with at least 4 other Midwestern carriers, operated equipment and provided service that existed outside federal regulatory oversight. This was not clerical error, accounting confusion, or administrative incompetence. It was systematic construction of parallel operations, trains that moved, crews that worked, cargo or passengers that traveled, all carefully excluded from documentation systems designed to capture every aspect of railway activity. Second, this parallel system required coordinated participation across multiple organizational levels. Station masters, mechanics, telegraph operators, engineers, inspectors, and senior management shared understanding of operational practices that were never written in policy manuals, never discussed in official correspondence, but consistently maintained across years and across corporate boundaries. The silence was not individual choice, but institutional culture. Third, the system generated costs that appeared in internal accounting and revenue that did not appear in reported income. The financial structure suggested either criminal fraud, undeclared revenue hidden from taxation and shareholder distribution, or something more complex, payments arriving through channels that left no documentary trace, for services that official records insisted did not exist. The record now established what happened. Metal moved through darkness. Workers were paid, money changed hands. Federal oversight was systematically deceived through methods that required industry-wide coordination. What remained uncertain was not the existence of the system, but its purpose. What moved at midnight that required such elaborate institutional concealment? What cargo or passengers justified the expense, the risk, the careful construction of parallel realities that consumed decades of coordinated silence? The answer would not arrive through accounting. Railway cargo in 1889, Illinois fell into categories that regulations made transparent. Agricultural products, grain, livestock, dairy, moved under bills of lading that specified origin farms, destination markets, and freight charges. Manufactured goods required commercial invoices that customs officials and state tax collectors reviewed. Hazardous materials, industrial chemicals, explosives, petroleum products operated under strict federal permits that railways could not violate without risking their operating licenses. Every legal cargo type generated documentation. The documentation served multiple purposes: taxation, safety regulation, insurance valuation, commercial dispute resolution. The system worked because economic incentives aligned. Shippers wanted legal protection, railways wanted limited liability, governments wanted tax revenue. Special accommodation traffic generated none of this documentation. No bills of lading, no commercial invoices, no hazardous material permits. Yet it moved regularly, consumed significant resources, and required industry-wide coordination to maintain its invisibility. 3 interpretations emerged from the evidence. The first possibility: railways transported illegal goods, smuggled materials, stolen cargo, or prohibited items that federal law forbade. The coordination suggested organized criminality on an industrial scale, with corporations risking their valuable federal charters to operate as sophisticated smuggling operations. The second possibility: railways provided covert service for government purposes that required invisibility. Federal agencies sometimes moved materials or personnel in ways that official documentation would compromise. The coordination might represent not criminality, but classified operations that used private infrastructure. The third possibility was the most disturbing. The cargo was not illegal, and the service was not government-sanctioned. The cargo was human, and the humans being transported at midnight had reasons, or someone else had reasons, why their movement could not appear in any record that the public might eventually access. The evidence could not distinguish between these interpretations, but the evidence insisted that whatever moved through darkness moved in systematic silence for reasons that made elaborate, institutional deception worthwhile. The physical process of making a locomotive administratively invisible required specific technical conditions that existed in 1889, but would become impossible within 2 decades. The mechanism operated through gaps in emerging technology and persistent institutional practices that had not yet modernized. Railway engines received permanent brass identification plates mounted on their boiler fronts and cab sides. These plates were manufactured by specialized suppliers, ordered through documented requisition processes, and affixed during final assembly. But regulations did not yet require centralized registration of plate manufacturing. A railway could commission plates that carried any number without federal verification that the number corresponded to an authorized engine. Engine 133's plate likely existed physically. Station masters saw something when phantom trains passed through darkness. But the plate identified an engine that federal registries insisted was never built. The deception required only purchasing brass identification from suppliers who asked no questions and maintained no comprehensive records. Physical manufacture was simpler. Railways often contracted for locomotive construction from multiple builders, sometimes ordering identical models that arrived sequentially. If the Chicago and Northwestern ordered 6 engines from Baldwin Locomotive Works, but registered only 5, the 6th locomotive entered service without official existence. Baldwin maintained records but did not submit them to federal authorities. The railway's chief engineer certified acceptance inspection for 5 engines while putting 6 into operation. The system worked because 1889 railroad regulation relied on institutional self-reporting. Federal oversight verified what railways claimed to operate, but did not independently audit manufacturing contracts. Inspectors checked equipment in yards but matched what they saw against company-provided lists. The assumption held that railways would not conceal equipment because concealment offered no obvious benefit. That assumption was wrong. Someone had identified the gaps where physical reality and administrative documentation could diverge. Someone had exploited those gaps at industrial scale. The unscheduled trains operated during specific hours, between 11:30 p.m. and 2 a.m., when legitimate passenger service had ceased, but freight operations had not yet begun. This window existed because 1889 railway scheduling separated passenger and freight traffic to prevent accidents and minimize delays. Passenger trains dominated daylight hours. Freight trains moved during early morning. Late night remained empty, a gap in published timetables that represented neither passenger service hours nor freight operation periods. The gap was intentional. Coal cost money, crew wages cost money, and running trains when demand was lowest made no commercial sense. Except that someone found use for those empty hours. Track access during the late-night window required only minimal coordination. Dispatchers controlled train movement, but dispatchers worked for the railway companies, not federal regulators. If a dispatcher received instruction to permit unscheduled passage, instruction that arrived through oral communication rather than telegraph messages that would be recorded, physical passage occurred without documentary trace. Station masters saw the trains pass, but wrote entries designed to record nothing useful. Telegraph operators maintained silence during the relevant hours, eliminating the communication records that would prove coordination. Mechanics performed maintenance during day shifts, attributing the work to legitimate equipment. The system exploited structural features of 1889 railway operations, the gap between passenger and freight schedules, the lack of automated train detection systems, the reliance on human operators who could be instructed to forget what procedure demanded they record. By 1910, these gaps would close. Automated signaling systems would record every train's movement electronically. Federal regulations would require real-time telegraph notification for any equipment using company tracks. Technology would make the late-night invisibility impossible. But in 1889, the window existed, and someone used it systematically. The Illinois state legislature in 1889 debated railway regulation with intensity that reflected the industry's political power. Railways controlled transportation infrastructure that small farmers, manufacturers, and municipal governments depended upon. Rate structures determined who prospered and who failed. Access to rail service marked the difference between viable communities and economic backwaters. The regulatory framework attempted to balance competing interests. Railways wanted pricing freedom and minimal oversight. Shippers wanted protection from monopolistic rate manipulation. State governments wanted tax revenue and economic development. The resulting legislation created systems where documentation was the mechanism of public accountability. Rates must be published, services must be scheduled, equipment must be registered. But certain interests existed outside these categories. Federal contracts for mail service generated scrutiny that commercial freight avoided. Military transport required security that passenger service couldn't provide. Political campaigns needed movement capabilities that public timetables would expose. The 1888 presidential election had demonstrated that political organizing required transportation coordination across state lines. Campaign managers needed to move organizers, literature, and resources without telegraphing their strategies to opposition. Standard rail service required advance booking, published schedules, station announcements, none of which served political interests that valued surprise and strategic positioning. Similarly, labor organizing in 1889 faced legal restrictions that made open coordination difficult. Union representatives needed movement capabilities that employer-controlled railways would not provide through standard service. Strike coordination required communication that telegraph operators might report to management. Special accommodation traffic existed in an economic and political context where multiple interests needed transportation capabilities that official oversight would compromise. The question was not whether such needs existed, they clearly did, but which interests commanded enough influence to construct industry-wide parallel operations. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway's annual revenue in 1889 was $4.2 million from documented sources. The estimated cost of operating Engine 133 and similar phantom equipment across the regional network totaled approximately $380,000, roughly 9% of one company's declared revenue, or potentially much higher percentages if the undocumented service generated income comparable to legitimate traffic. This was not petty fraud. This was industrial-scale parallel operations that required sustained investment, coordinated personnel management, and systematic regulatory deception. No company maintained such systems without clear benefit justifying the risk. The benefit structure likely operated through multiple revenue channels. First possibility: premium pricing for transportation that official documentation could not provide. Clients requiring invisibility would pay above standard rates, generating income that offset the expense of maintaining ghost trains and training personnel in coordinated silence. Second possibility: political accommodation that purchased regulatory leniency in other areas. If railways transported political operatives, government materials, or law enforcement personnel without official record, regulatory agencies might overlook infractions that would normally trigger penalties. The special accommodation became leverage. Third possibility: the phantom operations existed not primarily for revenue, but for institutional power. Railways that could move people and materials invisibly possessed capabilities that influenced political outcomes, labor disputes, and commercial competition in ways that traditional freight service could not. The investment purchased influence. All three possibilities shared one feature: the institutional benefit exceeded the financial risk. Railway executives who authorized parallel operations understood they were committing fraud that could destroy their companies if exposed. They proceeded anyway, which suggested the benefit was substantial enough to justify catastrophic risk. The system perpetuated because the people who operated it benefited more from its continuation than they feared its exposure. Howard Breslin's February 23 dispatch log entry: unscheduled southbound, engine unclear, no stop, acquired different meaning when examined alongside his transfer request 3 months later and the operational window identified in Chapter 21. The entry was written at 11:47 p.m., precisely within the hours when phantom operations occurred. Breslin had 14 years of experience, which meant he had worked at Elgin Station throughout the period when special accommodation traffic was being developed and institutionalized. He was not a new employee, confused by unusual practices. He was a veteran operator who understood exactly what he was documenting and what he was concealing. His transfer request cited completion of obligations. In 1889, employment contracts obligations were work duties, not temporary assignments. Breslin's phrasing suggested he had completed something specific, possibly a rotation through night duties that the system required of station masters to distribute the burden of participating in coordinated silence. His voluntary pay reduction was not sacrifice, but payment. He accepted lower wages to escape the specific responsibilities that late-night phantom operations required. He moved from a major junction station where unscheduled traffic passed frequently to a small rural station where special accommodation likely never operated. He bought his way out. The pension records that preserved his employment history showed that he lived another 14 years after his transfer, working quietly in DeKalb until retirement. He received no additional commendations. He filed no complaints. He never returned to night duties. The February 23 entry was not the confused observation of a bewildered employee. It was the last carefully worded documentation of a man who had learned what silence required and who had decided to purchase his release from further participation. He saw what moved through darkness. He recorded nothing useful. He left. Chicago's population in 1889 was approximately 1 million, making it the nation's second largest city and the commercial hub of the Midwest. The city's rapid growth relied on railway infrastructure that connected agricultural production, manufacturing centers, and shipping terminals. Railways were not peripheral to Chicago's economy, they were its circulatory system. The phantom operations identified in railway records intersected with several documented labor disputes during 1889. The Pullman workers' strike, though most severe in 1894, emerged from conditions that existed throughout the late 1880s. Labor organizers attempting to coordinate across multiple Midwestern cities faced transportation restrictions. Railway companies refused to sell tickets to known union representatives, and telegraph operators reported suspicious travel patterns to company management. Yet, organizing continued. Strikes occurred simultaneously in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Rockford, with coordination that suggested organizers had moved between cities despite transportation restrictions. The question was how. Municipal records from Chicago's Fourth Ward, a neighborhood with significant immigrant populations who worked in stockyards and rail yards, showed unexplained population fluctuations during 1889. Census estimates suggested approximately 8,400 residents, but quarterly labor surveys documented only 7,100 employed adults. The discrepancy of 1,300 people represented neither children nor elderly, but working-age adults whose presence appeared in residential counts but not employment records. Similar patterns appeared in Milwaukee's industrial districts and Rockford's manufacturing zones. People existed in populations that housing occupancy confirmed, but employment that formal labor markets didn't document. If railways operated invisible transportation and if labor organizers needed movement capabilities, that official oversight would compromise. And if political campaigns required coordination that public schedules would expose, then the demographic traces began to make terrible sense. The phantom trains were not just carrying cargo. They were carrying people whose movement could not appear in records that eventually became public. The record now established one certainty that could not be disputed. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway and its regional partners systematically operated parallel transportation infrastructure between January and April 1889, and likely for years before and after, that existed specifically to move people and materials that could not be transported through documented service channels. This was not criminal smuggling of prohibited goods. This was institutional construction of invisible capacity for clients whose interests required invisibility. The coordination required federal inspector compliance, interstate railway cooperation, employee training in systematic record evasion, and financial structures that concealed revenue while accurately reporting expenses. The system worked because everyone who participated understood what they were protecting and why exposure would end the arrangement. Station masters who recorded unscheduled trains rather than logging engine numbers. Telegraph operators who maintained selective silence during operational hours. Mechanics who attributed phantom maintenance to legitimate equipment. Federal inspectors who inventoried only what they were meant to see. The institutional architecture was sophisticated. It exploited gaps between emerging federal regulation and persistent administrative practices that relied on organizational self-reporting. It used the late-night operational window when legitimate service had ceased, but before dawn freight began. It distributed financial costs across legitimate budgets while concentrating undocumented revenue through channels that left no trace. What the system transported remained partially obscured. The documentary evidence proved systematic invisibility, but could not definitively establish whether the hidden cargo was labor organizers, political operatives, government personnel, or some combination that different clients required for different purposes. But the evidence was absolute on one point. The railways built industrial-scale infrastructure specifically designed to make people disappear from official records. They sustained it for years. They protected it through coordinated institutional silence, and then between April and June of 1889, the system was dismantled. The documentation of phantom operations ceased abruptly in late April 1889. Maintenance logs stopped recording repairs attributed to engine 133. Dispatch entries no longer contained ambiguous notations about unscheduled traffic. Telegraph operators resumed normal late-night communication patterns. The parallel system that had operated for months, possibly years, disappeared from institutional records as suddenly as it had appeared. The suppression was not gradual phase-out, but coordinated termination. 7 station masters who had rotated through late-night duties during the first quarter of 1889 were transferred to different locations by June. The transfers were not punishment. Salary levels were maintained or slightly increased, but they represented geographical dispersion that separated personnel who shared operational knowledge. Marcus Thornwell, the Northwestern's chief engineer whose signature appeared on equipment registries that omitted phantom locomotives, died of heart failure on June 8. His death was noted in company records with appropriate expressions of professional respect. His replacement, appointed within a week, was an engineer with no prior connection to the Chicago operations who had worked exclusively on the railway's Wisconsin routes. Federal inspection reports filed after May 1889 showed no further inventory discrepancies. Equipment counts matched registries perfectly. Maintenance logs aligned with federal submissions. The administrative impossibilities that had characterized the first quarter vanished. Inter-railway correspondence ceased using the phrase special accommodation traffic. Letters during summer 1889 addressed standard operational matters: track maintenance, cargo transfer protocols, equipment sharing agreements. The coded language that had confirmed parallel operations across multiple companies disappeared from archived communications. Someone had ordered suppression. Someone with authority across multiple railway companies and sufficient influence to coordinate personnel transfers, document destruction, and communications cessation. The institutional infrastructure that had required years to build was dismantled in approximately 6 weeks. The Interstate Commerce Commission's 1889 annual report, published in February 1890, devoted 247 pages to railway regulation in the Midwest. The document covered rate disputes, safety violations, equipment standards, and labor practices. It documented federal inspections, summarized company financial filings, and assessed infrastructure development across 14 states. It made no mention of phantom locomotives, undocumented service, or systematic registry violations. The Commission's review of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway praised the company's cooperative relationship with federal oversight and noted exemplary documentation practices. The report became the official record of railway operations during 1889. It was distributed to Congress, state governments, and railway companies. It was archived in federal repositories where researchers would eventually access it. It described a year of ordinary regulatory administration, competent oversight of compliant companies operating within established legal frameworks. The suppression was complete not because evidence had been destroyed, but because evidence had been separated. Maintenance logs existed in one archive. Registry submissions existed in another. Dispatch logs remained in station records. Telegraph communications were filed by date in company repositories. Each document examined individually appeared routine. Only cross-referencing revealed the structural impossibilities, and cross-referencing required suspicion that something was wrong. Suspicion that the Interstate Commerce Commission's official report actively discouraged by praising railways for their transparency. The administrative record closed not with dramatic revelation, but with bureaucratic normality. The phantom operations became what they had always been designed to be: invisible within systems that claimed comprehensive oversight. For 36 years, that invisibility held. The evidence existed. Nobody looked. Census records for Elgin, Illinois, listed 374 households in 1890. Among them was the Breslin residence, Howard and Margaret Breslin, station master and homemaker, no children. The census taker noted their occupations, their ages, their years of marriage, standard documentation of ordinary lives. Margaret Breslin died in November 1892, 3 years after her husband's transfer from Elgin to DeKalb. The death certificate cited pneumonia. She was 31 years old. The local newspaper published a brief obituary. Mrs. Margaret Breslin, wife of station master Howard Breslin, passed peacefully after a brief illness. She was known for her kindness and will be deeply missed. Howard Breslin never remarried. He worked 11 more years at the DeKalb station, maintaining dispatch logs with meticulous accuracy, living in company housing, participating in no civic organizations. When he died in 1903, his obituary described him as a man of few words who found peace in quiet routine. The personnel file that preserved his employment history contained one final notation: his pension was paid to no beneficiaries. He had no children, no surviving relatives, no designated heirs. The accumulated benefits were returned to the railway's pension fund. What Howard Breslin saw at 11:47 p.m. on February 23, 1889, was never recorded in any document that survived. What convinced him to request transfer, accepting reduced pay and diminished professional status, remained unspoken. What his completion of obligations had required of him vanished with his departure from Elgin. But the pattern of his life afterward, the isolation, the refusal to advance, the absence of family, the quiet ending, suggested a man who had protected himself through withdrawal. He had seen something. He had documented nothing useful. He had bought his release and lived the remainder of his years in careful silence. The cost of institutional participation sometimes appeared not in dramatic consequences, but in diminished lives. The Interstate Commerce Commission's regulatory framework evolved continuously after 1889. New legislation in 1893 required automated signaling systems that would eventually eliminate the operational windows that phantom trains had exploited. Federal reforms in 1906 mandated real-time telegraph notification for all train movements, closing gaps that had permitted invisible passage. Administrative modernization throughout the 1890s centralized equipment registries, making phantom locomotives technically impossible. The system that had operated in 1889 became obsolete not through exposure, but through technological progress. Railways could not maintain parallel operations once automated systems recorded every train movement electronically and transmitted that data to federal oversight in real time. By 1910, the mechanisms that had permitted systematic invisibility no longer existed. The evidence of what had occurred remained in separate archives, but the capacity to do it again had vanished. Historical accounts of 1889 railway operations focused on labor disputes, rate regulation debates, and infrastructure expansion. The standard narrative described an industry transitioning from chaotic competition toward regulated stability. Academic studies examine the Interstate Commerce Commission's early challenges, the political resistance to federal oversight, and the gradual modernization of safety standards. None mentioned phantom locomotives or parallel operations. The documentary evidence existed, but was never assembled into coherent narrative. The 1925 archive consolidation that revealed the discrepancies produced one junior clerk's marginal notation. Which document contains the error? But triggered no investigation. The institutional impossibilities were absorbed into historical silence, not through active suppression, but through administrative fragmentation. Evidence existed. Nobody assembled it into meaning. The parallel operations vanished from history as effectively as they had vanished from contemporary records. Until evidence sat untouched long enough that pulling it together became an archival reconstruction rather than a criminal investigation. Until the people who had participated were safely dead and institutional liability had expired. What specifically moved through darkness at 11:47 p.m. on February 23, 1889, when Howard Breslin recorded his deliberately useless dispatch entry, was never definitively established. The documentary evidence proved systematic invisibility, but could not reconstruct the invisible. Engine 133's operational logs showed 17 documented departures between January and April. The fuel consumption suggested passenger rather than freight service. Lighter loads, shorter runs, more frequent movement, but no passenger manifests existed. No ticket sales records survived. No correspondence identified who purchased the invisible transportation. The labor organizing theory that phantom trains moved union representatives between cities when official railways refused them passage remained plausible but unproven. The political coordination theory that campaign operatives used invisible infrastructure during the 1888 election cycle matched temporal patterns but lacked direct confirmation. The government transport theory that federal agencies moved personnel or materials through covert channels explained interstate coordination but contradicted the revenue structures that internal accounting implied. All three theories might have been simultaneously true. The phantom system could have served multiple clients for different purposes, with railways operating as neutral infrastructure providers who asked no questions about cargo as long as payment arrived. What remained absolutely certain was that the system existed, operated systematically, required industry-wide coordination, and was protected through institutional mechanisms sophisticated enough to deceive federal oversight for years before being deliberately suppressed. The limits of documentary evidence meant that some questions would remain permanently open. The archive could prove what happened, but not always why, could establish facts but not always interpret them, could demonstrate systematic practice but not always identify its ultimate purpose. The incompleteness was not failure of investigation, but inherent constraint of historical reconstruction from institutional remains. The junior clerk's notation in April 1925, which document contains the error, was filed with the Chicago and Northwestern Railway's archived records at the Wisconsin Historical Society. The file containing his marginal question sat in climate-controlled storage alongside 300,000 other railway documents spanning 70 years of operations. No follow-up investigation was initiated. The consolidation project that had revealed the discrepancies was administrative housekeeping, not criminal inquiry. The clerk had flagged a curiosity. His supervisors acknowledged the notation and moved to other work. The interstate coordination, the phantom locomotives, the late-night operations that had consumed significant resources and required systematic deception, all remained in separate archives, uncorrelated, protected by institutional fragmentation. Engine 133's fuel consumption records still existed in maintenance ledgers. Howard Breslin's ambiguous dispatch entry remained in the Elgin station log. Marcus Thornwell's equipment registries that omitted phantom locomotives sat in Interstate Commerce Commission files. The 17 letters using the phrase "special accommodation traffic" occupied corporate correspondence archives. Each document was authentic, properly filed, accessible to researchers who knew to request specific collections. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was destroyed. The evidence simply required someone to assemble pieces scattered across repositories maintained by different institutions for different purposes under different organizational systems. It required comparing documents that administrative practice kept separate. It required asking whether impossibilities in the record represented errors or evidence. For 95 years after Howard Breslin wrote Engine Unclear in February 1889, nobody asked. The phantom trains moved through darkness, carried what they carried, served purposes that generated enough revenue or influence to justify elaborate institutional deception, and then vanished when technological modernization made their continued operation impossible. They left no monuments. They generated no public memory. They survived only in administrative residue. Accounting discrepancies, ambiguous log entries, unexplained personnel transfers, and questions that institutional closure ensured would never reach conclusions. The record remained open because it was never officially recognized as requiring closure.